Hi everyone. Sorry for delaying lies a week, but there was a story about Federico de Montefeltro. It's killing me I couldn't fit in. So I'm gonna say it now. It's a little hard to see with our characters, but did you notice how Federico had a weird looking nose, like a little divot had been cut out of the top? Well, let me tell you how hardcore this guy was. When he was young, he was in a tournament and just a lance shattered and a fragment flew and it just skewered his eye. And he lost most vision in that eye. But rather than just retire from the whole warrior business or simply command with someone else telling him what was going on the battlefield, he had a different idea. So as soon as he was well enough, he ordered his doctor to come to him and told the doctor that he couldn't command on a battlefield if he couldn't see the scope of the battle going on. And then he ordered the doctor to cut out the bridge of his nose so he could use his peripheral vision from his good eye to see more of the battle. So yeah, Federico forever. Anyway, no more tales about the little known hero of the Renaissance. I enjoy him, he's definitely worth looking up some more. But I'll get to the main bit. You know, confessing the lies we told and all the things we left out and all the stories that didn't make it cut for the first Opium War. So let's start with the mistakes because, like usual, a few things slipped through. And by a few things, I mean flags. It cracked me up. It wasn't until we were already live that we realized we were using the pre-Act of Union flag for the UK. Last time we had the UK in an episode, I think we screwed up by using the post-Act of Union flag for a pre-Union episode, in which case it wouldn't really be the UK, but you know. And it really kills me because our artists go to such great lengths to make sure they're really on top of it and all the minor details are so right. All the uniforms, all this stuff, and then flags. Good God, every time, flags. Oh, there is one other minor thing in this episode. In the first episode, we talked about the UK just having lost its American empire. By that I meant the 13 colonies, but in the art we kind of threw in Canada too. So, you know, not Canada. But I think that's it. If I think of any others before we're done, I'll call them out. But I have so much to talk about in this. I want to rush on to the first episode. First, can you even... How bonkers is it that 10% of the government revenue of the world's largest economy was a tariff on tea, right? Like, I can't even imagine that was the US today. That would be like $380 billion, something like that, which is more than we spend on education and science and veterans combined, off tea. And that doesn't even account for the smuggling, which I've heard might have been at least about half as high as all the legitimate tea brought in. So bonkers, right? But now that we have a little bit of that scope, if you can even wrap your brain around it, which I can't, let's talk a little bit about that expedition to the Chinese court, right? That delegation probably should have gotten a better understanding of the Chinese culture and court politics before they went. Because it's not like the information wasn't out there, right? Jesuits had been interacting with the Chinese court for over a century, and they had written about it. But I guess just being a Protestant country, they didn't seem to be too in touch with all of that. Or arrogance carried them through and they just never looked it up. But as weird as it may seem, they actually thought they were being sensitive because the one thing they knew was that in the Confucian system, merchants were seen as one of the lowest classes. So finally, instead of just having the trading company representatives talk to them, they were sending a noble who was supposed to be more appropriate to meet with the Chinese court. One thing they should have known better, though, was and had an idea of what technology the Chinese, or at least the Chinese emperor, had. Because the British really did seem to be approaching this as if the Chinese were some barbaric tribes people that could be won over with flashy marvels like clocks and automatons. But the Chinese actually had these things, especially the emperor. Where they were behind Europe was really in agricultural and industrial technology, especially anything steam powered. But the Earl of Macartney didn't think that any of these mundane things would sort of suitably overall the Chinese government. And so instead, when they went to that meeting, what they showed off were mostly gadgets and trinkets. But it's not only the British, right? The Chinese emperor is sort of famous for being cantankerous, and he was really old by this point. He was like over 80, and he just wasn't receptive from the get-go. I mean, he sort of thought of the British as a barbaric nuisance and was a little bit set in his view. And it didn't help, right, the state that China was in. One of his most trusted advisors and one of the most energetic advisors he had recently lost them to certain internal strife. And speaking of internal strife, the political situation and the economic situation of China was very tenuous when the Macartney expedition showed up. In one of the ironies of history, the British actually tried to send out an expedition before this. They sent a guy named, I think, Charles Cathcart, but he died on the way over, and so the mission was scrapped. But if he had shown up on time, basically the empire would have been more secure, and there might have been no Opium War, right? This meeting might have gone much better. But to give you a sense of the Qianlong emperor, and I'm sorry about my Chinese, it's terrible, I know this. But I want to read you a few bits of this letter he sent to King George because everybody was requesting it and it's completely wild. And I'm barely cherry picking here, just to let you know. I'm pretty much just cutting out the bits that go into minutia, so here we go. And I've got a cool new setup, so I no longer have to read my iPad every time I quote something. So, you, O king, live beyond the confines of many seas. Nevertheless, impelled by your humble desire to partake in the benefits of our civilization, you have dispatched a mission respectfully bearing your memorial. Your envoy has crossed the sea and paid his respects at my court on the anniversary of my birthday. To show your devotion, you have also sent offerings of your country's produce. I have perused your memorial, and the earnest terms in which it is couched reveal a respectful humility on your part, which is praiseworthy. In consideration of the fact that your ambassador and his deputy have come a long way with your memorial and tribute, I have shown them high favor and allowed them to be introduced into my presence. To manifest my indulgence, I have entertained them at a banquet and made them numerous gifts. I have also caused presents to be forwarded to the naval commander and 600 of his officers and men, although they did not come to Peking, so that they too may share in my all-embracing kindness. If you assert that your reverence for our celestial dynasty fills you with a desire to acquire our civilization, our ceremonies and our codes of law differ so completely from your own that even if your envoy were able to acquire the rudiments of our civilization, you could not possibly transplant our manners and our customs to your alien soil. Therefore, however adept your envoy might become, nothing would be gained thereby. Swaying the wide world, I have but one aim in view, namely, to maintain a perfect governance and to fulfill the duties of state. Strange and costly objects do not interest me. If I have commanded that the tribute offerings sent by you, O king, are to be accepted, this was solely in consideration for the spirit which prompted you to dispatch them from afar. Our dynasty's majestic virtue has penetrated unto every country under heaven, and kings of all nations offer costly tribute by land and by sea. As your ambassador conceives for himself, we possess all things. I set no value on objects of strange or ingenious creation, and I have no use for your country's manufactures. It behooves you, O king, to respect my sentiment and display even greater devotion and loyalty in the future, so that, by perpetual submission to our throne, you may secure peace and prosperity for your country hereafter. So yeah, there was a little bit of underestimating of the culture on both sides, right? Imagine how that letter went over in England. By perpetual submission to our throne. So yeah, a little bit of a cultural misunderstanding. Oh, some of you guys also asked why we kept calling it the Honorable East India Company. And it's actually because that's its proper name. It's almost certain that at some point the Dutch East India Company or one of the other East India Companies will pop up in some of these episodes. And so I'm going to use the full title for every East India Company we happen to run into. Oddly enough, the Honorable East India Company was also known as John Company for reasons I can't quite ascertain. There seem to be a dozen reasons floating around out there, and none of them seem to have anything to do with the fact that one of the founders was named John. So if any of you know, feel free to put it in the comments below because I would love to know. But all right, I've spent way too much time on episode 1. I mean, it's super important to get the background, but let's get to the rest of it. In episode... there's one other thing I should touch on. Many of you asked why I refer to Guangzhou as Canton. I generally try and stick with names that I find will be the most important for anyone who wants to go out and do research on the period. Usually this is the historical name. But in this case, it was the name the British would have called the place because so many texts refer to it that way, especially older texts, and that's where we get the name, the Canton system. But okay, on to episode 2. First I want to thank Christina, who put some incredible posts on our Patreon page and reminded me of something amazing that I entirely forgot to put in my notes to talk about when I was writing my notes for Lies. And that is when Lin Zexu went to confront the Europeans. Before he got all shooty with them, he tried his greatest gambit, rhubarb. Somewhere, the information got passed along that the British needed rhubarb or they would die of constipation. So before everything else, he tried to impose an embargo on rhubarb to stop the British from trading opium. This did not work as intended. But seriously, Lin was a forward-thinking guy in a lot of ways, and he realized some of the advantages. He realized a lot of the advantage actually that the British had, more than most of the people working in the Chinese court. And he actually tried to do a huge amount of research on the West and commissioned the Illustrated Treatise on the Maritime Kingdoms, which, if you're into ancient maps, or old maps in this case, has some pretty amazing and solid Chinese maps of Britain. It's really interesting. And also, you know those sailors that Elliot tried and convicted for killing the Chinese merchant? Well, they were shipped back to England for their punishment, where it was promptly decided that Elliot's court didn't have any legal authority, and so they were let go without penalty. So there is some grounds for the Chinese to be upset with that whole proceeding. Not that they could ever possibly know that, but anyway, on to episode 3. Oh, actually, first I want to talk about opinion on the Opium War because it was a pretty divisive conflict, but it wasn't as universally condemned as a war for the right to sell drugs sort of you might think it would be today. And some surprising people throughout the West defended the British's actions, right? John Adams dismissed the importance of opium, saying, "The cause of the war is the kowtow, the arrogant and insupportable pretensions of the Chinese, that she will hold commercial intercourse with mankind, not upon terms of equal reciprocity, but upon insulting and degrading forms of relations between lord and vassal." And even Karl Marx gave it backhand praise, claiming that the English were evil in doing it, but that it was necessary to break China of its superstitious faith and barbarous and hermetic isolation from the civilized world. And even back in the UK, though this was so divisive that at first it looked like war might be avoided. Granted that travel time was so long that before word ever got to China, if Parliament decided not to go to war, they probably would have already been shooting at each other. But ignoring that, Parliament, it looked like, might have not voted for war, and then two guys started to really push war, right? James Matheson and William Jardine. And yeah, it's that Jardine Matheson, the trading company that is one of the biggest companies in the world today, right? So now you know Jardine Matheson, the multi-billion-dollar company, got its start in opium. Oh, and James Matheson's tomb, totally unironically, has a silver poppy wreath adorning it, which I thought was great. Oh, there were a couple of things I want to clarify in this episode. First, remember when that ship shows up, the Chinese ship, and it's got red flags, and so the English attack it because they think it means war? Well, the Chinese have no cultural or maritime signaling saying red means war, so miscommunication again. And remember that moment where the British ship runs the blockade and the Chinese end up defending it and the British end up shooting at it, which is a great microcosm of the whole war and how confused this whole thing was? Well, I wanted to explain that because it's so complicated. So, okay, remember, the Chinese at this point have embargoed opium. So the British have responded by blockading the Chinese ports and not letting Europeans trade with China. Then this British ship shows up, the Royal Saxon, and being one of those dubiously legal smuggler types that say, started this whole mess in the first place, they figure, screw it, let's run the blockade. They'll never fire on a British ship. And so they run the British blockade. One of the British ships now fires a warning shot at them to tell them to turn back. But the Chinese admiral in port sees this as them shooting at the ship running the blockade. So because the blockade is illegal in China, they feel obligated to defend the ship running it to show that the Chinese are still in control of their sovereign waters. So the Chinese end up defending a British smuggler who is running the British blockade that was set up to force the Chinese to let British smugglers trade with China. So history. Oh, and on top of that, by the way, the warning shot and any other shots were not even meant to be fired. Elliot didn't want that to happen, but the message didn't get there in time. But let's go on to the final episode, because talking about Elliot, I wanted to also say I found some sympathy for this guy. As I studied his life, I saw this man torn between an honest belief in his country and his country acting in ways that he might consider wrong. And in a way that we might not even be able to understand today, he was an English civil servant, right? It was his job and it was his duty to manage one part of the globe for the mother country according to its wishes. So we watch him trying to do this dance of staying technically within the boundaries of what he's being asked to do while still trying to be as little of a jerk as possible. And that doesn't let him off for some of this. But he got sympathy for me because in the end, what does it get him? Basically, everybody, including the Queen, ends up beating on him. Queen Victoria once said, "All we wanted might have been got, if not for the unaccountably strange conduct of Charles Elliot, who completely disobeyed his instructions and tried to get the lowest terms he could," which I think is a little unfair. But, you know, she was being talked to by other people. But anyway, when he was gone, things just really start to escalate in a bad way. Reading the latter period reminds me a little bit of some of the stories of the American experience in Vietnam, because as guerrilla attacks on the British increased, the British retaliated with increasing savagery, trying tying prisoners queue to queue, burning whole villages whenever a soldier was found dead, even using POWs for target practice. Which actually leads me to the last question. It seemed like a lot of you wanted to know, why didn't the British just take over China? And the short answer is they couldn't. They simply didn't have the resources. They had learned in India just how expensive it was to try and rule over a much larger and more populous country, and how, in the end, it wasn't just untenable, it was completely impossible, right? The British couldn't station millions of men halfway around the world to garrison and administer China. And so they never really had any intentions of taking it over. They saw where the profit was, and they were aiming straight for it the whole time. Oh, and next week, because the patrons are voting on topics that have already come up, topics that almost won but didn't quite get enough votes to win, instead of having them submit something for a vote, we asked them to submit questions instead. So I'm going to answer a couple of those here. Actually, before I do that, maybe I should explain a little bit better, because I see a lot of requests for topics in the comments of basically every video, and we don't actually choose what series we do. The patrons who contribute over at our Patreon page get to choose for helping us pay for the amazing artists and musicians we get to work with. And basically how it works is the patrons submit topics, one of which we choose at random. I suggest a few topics, and then the patrons get to vote on which one of those will eventually turn into a series. And so anyway, this time around, they didn't get to submit a topic, so we had them submit questions instead. So let's see what we got. Okay, here's one. So Did opium addiction really play a significant role in the Chinese defeat during the Opium Wars? That really depends on how you use the term significant, right? How you think of it, because there are tons of letters and documents from British forces talking about finding evidence that, especially at the garrisons, much of the Chinese force was high during combat. In fact, many of the garrison commanders took their own lives after losing, and one of them, in sort of the ultimate irony, chose to take his life by overdosing on opium. But I don't think it actually would have changed the outcome of the war. On the other hand, opium addiction among the soldiery can't have helped the Chinese chances. So let's find another. Why was Western or Indian opium more sought out than Eastern or Chinese opium? So far as I can tell, and I might be wrong on this, the British had better refining techniques, making for much more potent opium. I'm gonna answer this one because there's this whole Great Northern War contingent among our patrons. Somebody always requests Great Northern War, and I figured this is one of theirs. After the Great Northern War, Peter the Great of Russia proclaimed Russia as an empire. What were the requirements to call yourself an empire at the time, and why don't European nations do it like France and Great Britain? Well, we do talk about the British Empire, right? And we talk about the Napoleonic Empire. But to be an empire in the technical sense, as I understand it, and I could be way off here, you have to be sovereign over multiple countries. And in this case, a country that's no longer a country because you're sovereign over it is usually defined as places which historically have had their own sovereignty or that are part of a different sort of linguistic group from the ruling nation of the empire. And what makes the British not an empire is, except for sort of the home territories, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, they didn't so much conquer as they did colonize. They just move into a country as if nobody was there and then start ruling their subjects in that country rather than beat down the local king and tell the king that he was now the under king of the British monarchy, right? Ruling sort of under their direct control. Instead, their colonies usually did that, and then they would just continue to rule their colonies. But that's my take on it. It's a super loose definition. The whole what is and isn't an empire is in part sort of nebulous, but that's my take. All right, lastly, I know you have a rule against doing anything too recent, but if you were to pick a few topics from the past 50 years, what stories would you choose? I'm sure I will have a different answer another time, but the one that comes to mind is that I would love to contrast the reconstruction of Europe after World War II and why it worked to the settlement after World War I and why it just so horribly failed. I think there's a lot of lessons for how we think about war today and why the US seems to rapidly win wars but lose or at least be less successful at the occupation that follows. But this episode has run on forever. So I wanted to give a quick shout out to the fabulous wall scroll that our artist Lil made for the series. It's fantastic. And it's over at Don't Forget to Be Awesome, and the link's in the description below. And there's probably gonna be a link somewhere around me, or maybe we've just covered my face entirely with a wall scroll. But apparently our run on this one was super limited, so if you want one, grab one quick. Also, the Kiners have, as always, provided amazing music for the series, and you can listen to it in the video that just went live. There's probably a link below, and again, somewhere near me. Oh, and in case you thought I forgot, Walpole. While, as one of our patrons, Skylar, so rightly pointed out, we could make another connection through the Order of the Bath, which Walpole founded. I got one I really want to say. Because you know who started pumping up the tax on tea? The one that would eventually be 10% of the country's revenue, thus precipitating this whole mess? Walpole. And you know what makes it even better? He did it in the most Walpolean way. He knew that everyone hated excises or these sort of taxes on imports, and that these excises on tea were always super high. So in 1724, he got rid of these excises which everyone hated, much to the acclaim of the people. And then he snuck in some new inland duties, which were basically just another tax on tea, but even higher this time. But because he called it an inland duty and instead of an excise, and because it was a super complicated system that involved how you stored stuff in warehouses, it sailed right through and nobody even noticed. And like within a year or a couple of years, it was netting the government an extra 100,000 pounds. So that's where that tax on tea really starts to hike up. But with that, I'm done. I hope you guys enjoyed the first Opium War. Following that, we've got the Brothers Gracchi, where we look into the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic and explore what made it fall, which I'm super excited about. But yeah, I hope I'll see you all then. Take care, everyone.